All right, last week we talked about absolutism, or how kings thought that they should have all the power in England, specifically when Elizabeth I dies and she gets her cousin James I of England, who's actually James VI of Scotland, to take over and be their new king. And one thing that Elizabeth forgot to tell her cousin James is that the people of England have a parliament, and we let our parliament do something in England. So when James I and then his son Charles I both become the king of England, neither one of them want to allow the parliament, which is the people, have any say in government. They think that God chose them and their family to be in charge. That's called divine right. And so in England, they had to fight the king for that power. Today, we're going to look at what happens in France and in Russia when kings want all the power. So in France, they had a king. He was only 4 years old when he took the throne. They don't actually allow a 4-year-old to do anything, but his name is Louis XIV, and he was 4 years old, but his mom and an advisor actually ran the country for him. Now, Louis XIV has a nickname, the Sun King, and it's not for his sunny personality. It's actually due to the fact that he wants everything in France to revolve around him. His mother, who was Queen Anne, is going to run the country or the government for him because he's only 4 years old. And generally speaking, she did a pretty good job. She expanded the king's influence. She was pretty well liked amongst the people of France. She had an advisor since she didn't have a bunch of experience running a country. She had an advisor. It was the previous king's advisor as well, and his name was Mazarin. So in France, during the time of Louis XIV, as he was a child, his mom and the advisor Mazarin ran the country for him. However, when Louis was about 9 years old, the nobles, the rich people in France, rebelled against the current powers. They rebelled against Louis XIV. And we're not going to get into the details of that. It wasn't anything against him personally. It was just an uprising. He was 9 years old at the time, so his mom and the advisors decided it would be best to not have a 9-year-old in the middle of this conflict. And so they actually left the country so he would be safe. At age 13, Louis was crowned king, and that just means that he actually got to make the decisions at age 13. So his mom and Mazarin were not running the country for him. They were still going to be advisors to him, but a 13-year-old was given all of the actual power. One thing that had happened is that since Louis had technically been king from age 4 to age 13 at this point, he had been thinking, when I get to be fully king, I'm going to do this. And when I get to be fully king, I'm going to do that. And so he was just kind of waiting for the day. And one thing that was really fresh in his mind is that he hated the nobles. The nobles rebelled against him, and at age 9, there was nothing he could do about it. But now, at the ripe old age of 13, he could actually make some decisions. So he never forgave the nobles in France. So at age 13, he decided to take all the power of the French government for himself. So he is going to be an absolute monarch. Under Louis XIV, once he's 13, the nobles are going to have zero power. He's going to say, you don't get to do anything. You don't get to meet in parliament. You have to submit to me. He gave himself ultimate power over foreign policy, the Catholic Church, and taxes. Nobody can make any sort of decision without going through Louis XIV, and that's the way he wanted it. So he is going to very much weaken the nobility. And the people of France, unlike the people of England, kind of halfway believed in this whole idea of divine right, that, well, I guess God did choose him. The French people are a little more religious, a little more devout to the Catholic Church. And so the people of France under Louis XIV are basically going to not do anything about it. Not that they like it, but they do. They're still in that mindset where they think that God totally chose him. But Louis was paranoid that the nobles in France didn't like him. Well, because they didn't. And that's because he took away all their power. And so he got really paranoid, and he didn't want to live in Paris anymore because he felt like he was getting side eye from the nobles, in which he was. So he decides to build a new palace near Paris at like a little hunting village called Versailles. And he took a very small hunting cabin and made it into this massive palace. And he lived there once it was done, and it served multiple purposes. It was his personal household, so he lived there. The government was there, even though he didn't allow them to have decision making. They still had parliament meetings there, and he did that, and he built parliament. It's called the Estates General in France, so that he could kind of keep a watchful eye. And then also he was a young king who liked to show off his wealth from two powerful subjects that came from other places in France and the rest of Europe. Here's some pictures of the Palace of Versailles today. I don't know if those even really do it justice. This is probably the most famous of the rooms. It's called the Hall of Mirrors. Louis XIV spared no expense. Okay, we said that Louis wanted to take all the power, and part of that was trying to take the power from the Catholic Church, and he attempted to control the Catholic Church in France. Didn't really have a lot of success, unlike in England, where Henry VIII took control of the church, kicked out the Catholic Church. The people of France are a little more Catholic and a little more devout, and so it didn't really work out for him that well. Louis XIV also created huge armies in France and tried to conquer his neighboring lands. The problem is that he was never really successful. So he spent a lot of money and killed a lot of his own men and really made a lot of enemies around Europe. Because just because he lost doesn't mean that his neighbors are going to appreciate that he tried to take them over. So Louis is going to put France in a position in which they are going to have some enemies next door that they didn't necessarily need to have. Louis died at a very old age for that time period at 76 years old. So he was 4 when he became king, and he was 76 when he died. He left the kingdom to his 5-year-old great-grandson, who ruled as Louis XV. He had several sons, and he had several grandsons. Several of them died due to disease, and several of them, because the monarchs of all of Europe are kind of intermarried, a couple of his grandsons ended up being the kings of neighboring countries as well, specifically Spain, because like we talked about with Mary was the Queen of England, but she was also the Queen of Spain because she married the Spanish king. They're all so intermarried. They're like multiple countries. And so he had to leave the kingdom to his 5-year-old great-grandson. So Louis XIV established the idea of absolute power in France, that the king should be in charge of everything. Louis XIV is not going to pay the price for this. Like I said before, the people of France are going to be a little more religious, and they're going to basically let Louis XIV get away with this. They're going to let Louis XV kind of get away with this, but you wait, Louis XVI, who's coming up, the people are finally going to have enough. They're going to rise up and they're going to have a super bloody revolution because they don't like what the king is doing.